It is an absolute pleasure to be sharing with you a recent panel discussion around licensed cultivation of cannabis, not just from South Africa, but Lesotho and the United States as well. And we specifically look at a local cultivator in South Africa that's also got GMP approval and the journey they've been through to achieve that. We look at Lesotho and their shipments to Australia as well as Israel, where there's been a real challenge in terms of getting products into Israel. We talk about that journey. We talk about things like control union certification. And then we take a closer look at the United States, comparing activities between states. Now, I want to also highlight that we're going to be speaking to Cannabis from Switzerland, where they have actually talked us through the track and trace process and what they've seen across the spectrum, also their success in the adult use pilot programs. And then we go back to Phyllis Sunday to find out how do we increase inclusion in the Eastern Cape when it comes to cannabis and commercialization in South Africa. I hope you enjoyed this panel discussion and the recording and the information shared.
Everyone, my name is Spusiso Aba, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Africa Cannabis Advisory Group. We're a services provider specialized in the medical cannabis and industrial hemp industries. We work with a broad range of industry stakeholders, including entrepreneurs, corporates, governments, and investors. ACA specializes in the conceptualization and execution of cannabis projects, with a focus on strategy development, investor readiness, capital raising, compliance, and global sales and distribution. Today, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our webinar titled The Cannabis Cultivation Risk Management. Before getting started, I'd just like to thank our main sponsor for tonight's event, Aeroside Africa. Aeroside is a leading air purification technology provider that has proven to be effective in helping combat fungal diseases in cannabis, particularly powdery mildew, which for anyone who has grown cannabis can attest to how pervasive and destructive powdery mildew can be to a cannabis crop. Aeroside was developed in the US for NASA and is also effective in ensuring clean air in processing rooms in cannabis operations. We'd also like to highlight our charity partner for tonight's webinar, Friends of Hemp South Africa, which was founded by Ayanda Bum, a leading cannabis activist and entrepreneur. Friends of Hemp is a broad-based alliance of South African citizens across the private sector, research institutions, government, NGOs, and associations, and is concerned about the prevention and criminalization of industrial hemp in South Africa. Set up as an NGO, the organization's efforts are driven by a desire to unlock the economic and socioeconomic potential of industrial hemp and to provide South Africans the option to earn a legitimate livelihood from a recognized agricultural crop. The NGO is playing a critical role in bringing to reality a thriving and inclusive cannabis economy in South Africa. We encourage a donation of as little as 100 Rand or more towards the charity, and the link will be shared in the chat as tonight's webinar proceeds. Now, it's difficult to believe how cannabis has transitioned from a controversial underworld industry that governments across the globe have spent billions to try eliminate to today being a global concern, transforming the health and wellness of millions of individuals across the globe. Not only that, but the industrial potential of cannabis to help combat climate change and to create sustainable materials for use across a broad range of industries, including textiles, bioplastics, building materials, biocomposites, biofuels, and paper is only just being developed. To really get a glimpse of the potential of the cannabis industry to spur economic growth, create jobs, and to improve our health and wellness, we only need to take a look at North America, in particular the US and Canada, two of the world's most advanced cannabis economies. Despite being federally illegal, the cannabis industry in the US has helped create over 425,000 jobs in just a matter of years. The US cannabis industry is estimated to be worth over $25 billion and growing at over 20% a year. Studies are showing that the use of dangerous and addictive opioids in states where cannabis is legalized in the US is on a downward trend as more patients suffering from chronic pain move towards cannabis use. Now remember, the opioid crisis in the US is responsible for the deaths of between 30 and 70,000 people a year from overdoses. It's no wonder that South Africa, alongside many African countries, is betting on cannabis to resuscitate economies across the continent. With an unemployment rate of 35% and growing, South Africa needs to urgently create the right environment for the cannabis economy to thrive, whilst ensuring that the poorest in our country have the opportunity to meaningfully participate in this new legal industry. Now, cannabis cultivation remains one of the most challenging yet rewarding functions of the legal cannabis industry, and one where Africa has a competitive advantage versus most regions in the world. The cost of cultivating medical cannabis in Africa can be 50 to 90% lower than regions such as Canada and Denmark, where temperatures can fall below 20 degrees Celsius. Not only that, but the cost of labor and inputs on the continent is significantly cheaper than regions such as Australia, which share many of the climate advantages that Africa benefits from. It's no wonder that over 85% of the African cannabis entrepreneurs that we've engaged with over the last few years have all been looking to establish cannabis cultivation operations. Stellar cultivation practices and compliance standards can result in significant long-term value creation and sales, allowing growers to produce market-leading flower and extracts for local and export markets. At the same time, cannabis cultivation has proven to be a significant challenge for the legal cannabis industry across the globe. We only have to look at Canada to illustrate this point. Canada was the first G7 country to fully legalize cannabis and only the second country in the world after Uruguay to do so. Canadian licensed producers, most of which were focused on cultivation, began to attract significant investment to build cultivation facilities, a trend that we've been seeing all across the globe. Over 30 billion in capital expenditure has been deployed in the Canadian cannabis industry, and a decent percentage of that has gone towards cultivation. Initially, when Canada fully legalized cannabis, investors were squarely focused on rewarding companies for being ambitious with how much cannabis they were looking to cultivate. Capital for cultivation was easy to come by, and billions of dollars were invested in all types of cannabis facilities. For example, Aurora Sky, one of Canada's flagship cannabis cultivation facilities developed by the company Aurora, is around 6 hectares of cultivation size, a massive and almost unthinkable scale for a fully indoor facility. The facility was estimated to be able to produce 100+ tons of cannabis annually and cost over $120 million to develop. Last week, it was announced that this facility would be closed after only being run at 25%. This story, one of many, illustrates just how difficult cultivation is to crack for the cannabis industry. Now, don't worry, there are many other positive examples, so I don't want to be too discouraging so early in our webinar, and we'll discuss some of this further on. Now, in 2018, when the Canadian cannabis industry was legalized, the industry was definitely on a high, and the stock market reflected that. Cannabis shares were up in anything between 100 to 2,000% in the early days of legalization. However, as these companies started to report financial results from 2019, it started to become clear that cultivation assets did not necessarily equate to cannabis sales and profits. Now, some of the major challenges experienced by these companies include, number one, product quality. To put it bluntly, consumers both on the medical and recreational side were extremely disappointed by how poor product quality was in the early days. Number two, pricing. Now, due to high taxes, high capital expenditure, compliance costs, the legal cannabis products were 2 to 5 times more expensive than the illicit alternatives. And so a huge amount of energy and focus has to and continues to be required in order to transfer the production and consumption of cannabis into a legal framework. Number three, compliance. Anyone who has worked in the legal cannabis in the industry will tell you that compliance remains a major challenge for cannabis operators. Most of us in this space are actually on track to receive our honorary PhDs in cannabis compliance. That's how immersive you need to get to really solve a lot of these challenges. And lastly, distribution and market access. Often, Canadian licensed producers were growing cannabis in quantities that did not match their confirmed demand. This resulted in a significant oversupply in the market and saw a ballooning of inventory of cannabis on balance sheets. In other words, a lot of cannabis was being stored because it could not be moved to the consumers who would be interested in buying the product. Now, many of these challenges offer key lessons for newly established cannabis companies. And today, we'll be getting insights from some of Africa's leading cannabis entrepreneurs and thought leaders on this very topic. I'm excited to unpack this further with my friend and colleague, Jeff Verlinden, who will be moderating today's discussion with our esteemed panelists. Jeff Verlinden is a sales executive at Separations, a company that has been in the South African laboratory and pharmaceutical equipment supply and support space for over 3 decades. Jeff is a biochemist and joined Separations in 2010, working in their pharmaceutical support division, and has worked with many of South Africa's leading pharmaceutical companies. Jeff has a passion for cannabis extraction, formulation, product development, and is one of the country's most respected experts in the cannabis industry. Jeff, over to you to introduce our panel.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Sebs. Well, I'm really excited for today's discussion because we're going to really try to unpack, where are the opportunities and what are the challenges in, cultivation and commercial cultivation. And specifically, we'll be more focused on perhaps the medical market for now, but what are the hopes and aspirations around the responsible adult use markets, which still make up about 90% of the global economy around cannabis, and will probably maintain some of that share going forward as markets open up and drug policies reform. So I always like to have panelists self-introduce themselves personally, but I'm going to give you a bit of a scope of what we have on today. Today, we've got obviously a leading cultivator as well as a GMP processing facility on. We have psilocybin. We've got David on, who's going to be talking about the challenges they've overcome in Lesotho in moving the products forward and their exports. We've got Sunday from the Eastern Cape that's going to speak more to the traditional aspects of cannabis and the challenges seen by the local cultivators that have been excluded. And then we've got Luke on, who's also been very prolific in terms of compliance software, track and trace software, and has actually had that exposure to multiple operations, which are not just in Switzerland, where he's obviously had a lot of success between the cantons and the adult use projects, but also without Africa and other parts of the world. So looking forward to all those experiences. And Sebs, we're going to bring you in as well as our favorite investment banker. Can I ask that we may be introduced in the following order? Can I have David start us off, followed by Sunday, then Gabriel, moving to Luke, and then Sebs, I'm going to just introduce you as someone who's had extensive experience, mostly in the UK market, to Goldman Sachs and Investec. I think everyone knows who you are as the organizer of the webinar, and we're going to jump straight into questions from that point. So David, can you kick us off with a quick introduction?
How's it, everybody? I'm David Farber. I work for Hemp Africa / Prosperity Farm. We are a medical cannabis cultivation business based out in Maseru, Lesotho, or just outside of Maseru. And we have successfully shipped medical cannabis out of the African continent to the likes of Israel and Portugal, and hopefully many other continents very soon.
Awesome. Sunday. Sunday, you might be on mute there.
Sorry. Hi, greetings everybody. My name is Sunday Mashagacha, and I am based in Port St. John's. I've been working with the various communities that cultivate cannabis within the Pondoland Belt since 2015, advocating along with the likes of Ricky Stone, Simon Sperry, and Griggs Winnie, who are at Umzimvubu Farmer Support Network, advocating for the spraying of fields to come to a halt. And I am now working with the farmers within the same area with the newly formed structure that represents the farmers from around the same areas, which is Abalimi Bomya, directly translating to cannabis growers of Port St. John's. And yeah, thank you for having us here this evening.
Awesome. Excellent. Gabriel.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Gabriel Turan, founder of psilocybin. It's the first company to have a cultivation and GMP manufacturing license in South Africa. Basically specializing in extracts, final packaging and formulations. We've got our own product line in South Africa currently on the CBD side. And we're aiming to also help other brands, especially now as things open up, to help other cultivators to GMP package their flower and even extract products for export and local market. And that's where we've positioned ourselves for now. Thanks.
Awesome. Great. Luke.
Awesome. First of all, thank you for having me, Sips. Jeff, always a pleasure. My name is Luke Richner. I'm originally from Switzerland. I come from supply chain management, international trade background. And what we do is basically track and trace supply chain, transparency, compliance, C2sell, whatever you want to call it. We're based in Switzerland, currently installed in 14 countries on 4 continents. See great traction in Africa. I really believe in the African market. We did have the pleasure to spend some time in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, but more and foremost in South Africa. Yeah, I mean, in the end of the day, what we do, we looked at international standards and processes, looked what some of the early days companies in that space were doing, US, Canada specifically, and believe we found a little bit of twist on that, which I'm happy to share a bit more in a bit.
Awesome, excellent. I see that Cody's just joined us from Utah. So yeah, he's from obviously Utah, which has had a pretty strong medical focus, which will be great to kind of unpack the process there. I think Utah was legal since 2020 in terms of really allowing dispensaries to operate, or pharmacies. So Cody, if you can give us a quick introduction about your background, about obviously Dragonfly Wellness, and get us kicked in maybe to a bit about you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, everybody. I really appreciate it. I'm honored to be on the call with everyone. Yeah, so I'm currently based in Utah in the United States, the state of Utah, and I'm head of facilities for Dragonfly Cultivation. We're a vertically integrated medical cannabis company. Our parent company is based out of Salt Lake. That's where our retail storefront is. So we do manufacturing, distribution, you name it, all of the above. And my background is 20 years in the legal medical and recreational market in California. So I took a job here about 6 months ago. I was a consultant for about a year before that. And I'm excited to be here in kind of a new marketplace for me. But I have a lot of experience in California, designing, building, and managing cultivation facilities, retail storefronts, processing and manufacturing facilities.
Awesome, excellent. So Sips, we've done a quick introduction to you, so no worries about that. Let's kick into maybe our first question. I think I want to direct this to David. So obviously, David, can you give us a bit of context on your journey in the Lesotho market? You know, essentially, you know, Hemp Africa, the transition obviously to Prosperity Farm. You know, what has the journey been like from onset to where you are right now, and some you know, the initial experiences and challenges?
It's been a lot of fun and a lot of headaches, but it's been a great learning experience. We started off in 2019. We started building our greenhouse in May that year. We then finished in December with a test grow from their test harvest. And we were fully operational by the beginning of 2020, whereby we actually successfully shipped our first shipment out of the South African or African continent to Israel in August that year. We then did another shipment later on in that year. And then we've had a few hiccups since, just based on other governments' regulations. And those are the hiccups that everyone will face, obviously. But that's pretty much the short of the long in our journey. We've transitioned from Hemp Africa to Prosperity Farm because we're primarily a medical cannabis facility and not a hemp facility. And I get about 150 calls a day for hemp, which is never ideal. But we brought on some international investment who who wanted us to transition the name, not only because of, the incorrect name that we had, because subsequently Hemp Africa has actually grown to have a very good brand globally, but more to represent what we're about. We're about bringing prosperity into Lesotho, uplifting the market, helping the economy there, giving major jobs to the local communities over there. So on that front, not many hiccups. And funny enough, on the cultivation side, there's always going to be school fees that you pay. On the cultivation side, not so many risks, but more on the compliance of, whether it's our compliance, which is not really an issue most of the time. It tends to actually always be your end user or your buyer's compliance. So you tend to get many calls a week. I've got a buyer. Okay, cool. Show me the license. Well, the license doesn't exist, or it's through here and here, or the guy wants the offtake so he can get a license in South Africa. So there's all, a lot of the time the compliance is always on the other side of the spectrum. Not to say that our compliance was easy, because it certainly was not. It took a lot of hard work and dedication from us and our team, especially our CEO. He had boots on the ground, and he hit the ground running, and subsequently it's paid off. We thank God are successful, and always hiccups, but yeah, that's pretty much where we're at the moment. 2022 seems to be an amazing year ahead for us, luckily and thankfully. So very exciting times to come. But as I say, there's always going to be hiccups, as you guys all know in the industry yourselves. But you live and you learn, I suppose.
All right, awesome, David. Appreciate that. Phyllis Sunday, I'm going to maybe ask you to step in here as well. I mean, you represent local interests from, let's just call it, stakeholder farmers in the region in the Eastern Cape. It's been challenging to get the interplay correct between government. I mean, in South Africa right now, there is no commercial access in terms of trade of cannabis besides medical cannabis for export or through distribution locally through what's called the Section 21 access to a medicinal product. So it is somewhat limited in terms of inclusion, despite the historic history of traditional medicine and the cultural uses of cannabis. Can you maybe speak to us, Phyllis Sunday, about, you've seen the businesses blossom. Theoretically, they shouldn't be a direct competitor to the illicit market in the immediate term, because it's been mostly export facing or medical card focused in terms of access through Section 21. However, that never tends to really be the reality. There's always some degree of, some loose operators in the market, and you might see some high quality indoor that slips through the market. Tell me what your experience has been in the Eastern Cape with local farmers coming to you for support in terms of access into this market.
Yeah, that's a big issue for us, finally actually entering into the market. I mean, there's all of this hype around Bonderland being one of the best places, and in fact, the capital of cannabis cultivation in Southern Africa. And we haven't taken off. We haven't moved from the 2018 privacy ruling. Nothing has changed for us. Even that didn't really speak to us. So for every action that seems to be a progress in the side of government or industry in general, we are constantly left behind, because every policy that there is right now just doesn't work for us. For instance, the last harvest, we've been sitting with tons and tons of cannabis that haven't seen the market, and simply because of the competition that's risen, and as well, our quality, as you say, has been compromised because of the newer strains that are fashionable, obviously, and with good reason. They've got higher THC than what we have. So for us, if we do actually want to take off, while we're also considering protecting our heritage genetics, it means that we can only be limited to medicinal processing, cultivation for processing, because we simply cannot compete with the recreational market any longer, with everything that's happening. So it's a tight spot for us all the time, and we don't really have anyone to bounce off with and to come along and help us. But what we are getting is government constantly hyping all the opportunities that marijuana brings about, which we are sitting here and thinking, okay, when is it coming to us? So it's a bit of a frustrating journey for us, has been since. Lack of knowledge about policies, about the developments within the industry. It's a variation of things that are just hindering us from actually taking off.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I think what we'll circle around to the discussion on land races and the preservation of genetics, but I completely hear your comments around, you know, flavor of the month, cultivation strains coming in, higher THC, you know, genetics infiltrating into the local domestic flora. So it's that's definitely a topic, and I think we need to see some kind of reform in terms of access. I think it's very difficult to hit a mark, especially when that mark is multiple regulatory systems around the world. You know, Israel's completely separate from Australia, which is a world apart from EU GMP into Europe. So there's a few things to unpack here. I think on that point, Gabriel, let's bring you in. I know that you were one of the first licensed cultivators for GACP, Good Agricultural and Collection Practices, but also got the head house and the facility on GMP approval. For anyone who doesn't know, South Africa is a PICS member, which means we are harmonized to some extent around GMP standards. Naturally, there's still some additional scrutiny when you're going into certain jurisdictions to verify the level of the GMP. But one thing I want to ask you about is there was a lot of news. I remember the Bloomberg article around the future aspirations of psilocybin, also in the IPO space. Can you maybe unpack, you know, where you are in that journey? You know, what is the forward-looking forecast? It's not the easiest market right now to be raising capital, that's for sure. But it's one where, you know, it's got to probably be the right flavor for the right investor and the right story behind that listing. So give us a bit of an update.
Okay, so maybe I must tell you the full story. So psilocybin was created not to be solely in the cannabis space. So we're using cannabis and the hype around cannabis, and that's what we've done. We use the hype around that to build a global brand, a global presence, or recognition at least. With the end goal to actually do an IPO, which we're now in the process of doing, but we're not taking a cannabis company to market, because there's a dime a dozen, like you said earlier, crash and burn. The market, I feel, it's probably too late if you're not in it to get in, but if you're in it, you need to survive. So the psilocybin itself, we took a different stance at it. We decided, okay, we're going to use cannabis as the thing that will propel us into the global health solutions industry. So what we are looking at deploying is, and you'll see it when the prospectus come out, cannabis is only a very small portion within it. We're looking at a wellness solutions company from genetics, human genetics, not plants, for the confusion possibly, yeah. So from the human genetics, understanding that, plotting that out, giving specific nutrition formulations. We've got the GMP facility on our side to also manufacture. And then going into wearable devices, how do we track? Because that's going to be the future of healthcare. So it's not just about one single thing, it's how you package all of these different solutions or things out there, from tech to cannabis to psychedelics to all of these things. How do you package that and take it as one product into the market? And that's what we're planning to do on a global scale, starting in South Africa. Starting raising money here, acquire the assets that we are looking at acquiring globally, and then from there hop into like a NASDAQ or something like that to really deploy the end solution. So cannabis was merely just a start for us. Helped, it worked in the space, luckily for us. There was still a hype a year ago. I think the hype is towards the flip side today, but luckily it worked out in that sense for us. So in terms of the IPO, we're very, very close. We're probably about a few weeks out in terms of being able to circulate the prospectus. So things are looking really good for us in that space. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I would say precision medicine is definitely a place to go into. Personalized precision medicine is going to be a big future market. I mean, we saw with psilocybin as well, the first clinical trials approved by SAPRA, our regulator, about 2-3 weeks ago. So that's also positive news from a regulatory position in terms of enabling these clinical trials to move ahead on the continent. We definitely have a very diverse population subset for global trials and assessments for medicine. Personalized medicine obviously goes a little against that orthodox approach to your mass production around a standard drug modality or for a certain indication. But we'll see how the regulators adjust. I mean, we've seen the same thing with precision tissue culture. It's an interesting world to see what's happening. And I know you're in the biohacking space, so curious to know more. I'm going to jump to Luke. Luke, you've had the benefit of obviously seeing a lot of operations going through the rigmarole. Obviously, when people start out, typically compliance was not always first of mind, but they've soon realized, independent of markets, consumers have the right to know what's in their products, to have full traceability of the product. So whether that's responsible adult use, whether that's medicinal, it's more critical in medicinal with a vulnerable patient subset. So there's definitely a need for increased traceability, increased documentation about sourcing. Talk us through in terms of the importance of track and trace and what you've seen maybe develop and the trends you've seen in the last, maybe even let's use the last 12 months. Where's the focus been in the markets you've been engaged with?
All right, I'll start with what track and trace is. Basically, it's who did what, how, when, and why, right? And it starts from the moment you put the seed into the seed registry, you create a plant passport, then you set the seed, who is giving which fertilizer, is the person trained for the fertilizer, is the training refreshed, etc., etc. So it goes all the way throughout the supply chain. Is it harvest? Is the scissors cleaned for the next batch? So track and trace is somewhere in between. Do you have to record everything or just parts of it, which then depends on the end product that you actually generate, right? I would say their natural, how do you say, the legacy grower, let's call it like that, which I hate the term, but anyways, old school grower maybe was not used to record everything for certain reasons, and they sometimes have a harder time to go in that direction. And what we've seen over the last 12 months was they really hang on to that. They realize the benefit of it. They realize that it keeps everybody off their backs. It keeps also their own systems or their own processes more efficient. So we've seen a big shift and basically wherever we're installed from originally, like, what do these guys want from us? Like, is this guy here to show my boss what I'm doing? Or is this guy here to show the investor or the government? Or what do they want from us? To actually like, oh my God, can we also trace this? Can we log in? Can we actually make sure we know who is when in which room? Because on one hand side, yes, it might keep a lot of things off your shifted with, let's say, a large overproduction in the cultivation side, it also gives you a competitive edge, right? Compliance, traceability, and documentation is one of those things that actually allows you then to share that with your end consumer, to share that with your buyer, to share that with whoever you have to share that along the line. And I think that shift from like, what do you guys want from me, to can we even track more, to, oh my God, we track more. It doesn't just make me understand my processes better and become more efficient internally, but it also allows me to share with my buyer, potential buyer, and bind them, right? There's that beauty in keeping a steady product. Now, one thing is, of course, medical, you got to keep a steady product. You have to have your active ingredients and yada, 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 all the parameters. And in Europe or in Switzerland specifically, we're now going more into the rec market, but also don't forget that CBD wants to have a certain level of quality control and quality standards, right? And continuous quality standards. And I think the biggest shift was from what do you want from me to can we do more, I think that's to sum it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, there is going to be that formalization of the sectors across the world, and I think it comes down to that uniformity. But we've got to be careful of uniformity, because we saw what happened with Aurora Sky and the need for over focus on automation and scale and try to increase efficiencies with more and more cultivation capacity. But you need to understand the consumer, and if it's going to be largely adult use, they're going to be very discerning. And talking about discerning consumers, I think let's bring Cody in here. Because Cody, you've obviously moved from the California market, which has a balance of quite a long history of high quality cultivation, focus on the consumer. Going to Utah, I mean, I'd like to get some of your contrast between, I mean, Utah, in my understanding, and I don't know if it's changed, but it's been a very medicinal focused market. It's been one of, you have to see a pharmacist, pharmacy needs to dispense to you in a medical platform. It's almost similar to how I'd put parallels for our Section 21 approvals here locally. It goes through a rigorous process, whereas, there's been more flexibility with adult use in California. And, how have you seen that adjustment? Because you've been there for 6 months. What is your biggest drawback, contrast or maybe advice to, seeing a very mature market like California, seeing Utah that's come online slightly differently, maybe similar to South Africa, but it could change very quickly to adult use. Talk us through maybe some of those comparisons.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really excited to be here in a strictly medical state again, because I kind of grew up with the California cannabis marketplace evolving just due to my age and where I was at in my career with it. I came out of the, traditional market, as we call it there. And anybody that's been involved as long as I have did also. And so California, I was involved on the medical side of things for a long time, and that was great. It's just a great thing to be involved with. It's a very grassroots kind of community-based where it came from, and then it turned into a no-holds-barred, very competitive, low-margin, super aggressive recreational market, and a lot of big brands coming in, a lot of billboards, and you name it. It just kind of went nuts. And the bottom, frankly, dropped out of it. There wasn't enough regulation from the state level to keep the licenses at a reasonable level, and it got a little too cutthroat, and all the mom and pops went away, and most of the medical aspect just went on the sidelines, if that, or disappeared altogether. And so much of what's going on in the United States is due to politics, local politics, state politics. California is a Democratic state, very, very liberal. Utah is a Republican state, very, very conservative. And so the only cannabis that's available here is strictly medical. And they keep it very tight. There's very few operators. To put it in perspective, I was last operating in California in a very small town called Palm Springs. It's a tourist town in Southern California area. And I don't know the population off the top of my head, but it's a small town, and there's 20 dispensaries and 100 cultivation facilities, or something like that. In the state of Utah, we're one of only, I believe, 12 license holders in the entire state. So that's great to be kind of a big fish in a small pond, and the fact that the government entities had the whereabouts or the wherewithal to not give out too many licenses. And really keep a kind of tighter grip on who's operating, how tightly they're operating, and what kind of operations are running.
Awesome, thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, this is a question that's been raised for a few years now. Is like, is there a need, or should there be a need to cap licensing? It's a difficult point. Technically, the regulator here's position is, if you're compliant, you shouldn't be allowed to participate in the space. At the same time, I think a lot of people have rushed in and starting to now realize the deficiencies in business development and partnerships in terms of supply. It's going to be challenging if you haven't mapped out those networks internationally. And on that point, Sibs, maybe you can give us a few pointers here in terms of, how's African cultivators across maybe Zimbabwe, Lesotho, South Africa, how they're stacking up in the global competition? Should we be focusing on the global competition, or should we focus on domestic? I don't want to lay you too many points here, but maybe talk us through the African experience with cultivation, And yeah, we'll maybe pick up advice on that in the next question. I said you need to unmute there. Cool.
Sure. Thanks so much for that question, Jeff. So, look, I think there's obviously a lot of countries that are looking to legalize cannabis and sort of take advantage of this opportunity and this massive sort of shift in societies across the globe. However, I do think that Africa as well as South America, do sit in quite a unique space when it comes to the global cannabis industry from a product cost perspective. As mentioned, African cultivators and inputs and labor and so forth is considerably lower than different parts of the world. Now, granted, a lot of the developed economies that have legalized cannabis and have got access to millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, to build their industries and have had that lead in terms of time, there's definitely an embedded advantage there. However, as the industry begins to mature, I think countries and geographies will begin to sort of double down on what they're strong at. So as mentioned, there's many cannabis cultivation facilities that are closing down in countries like Canada, where the cost of production is too high. So the onus is on on us to attract the right investment, get the right partners, bring in sort of indigenous and traditional knowledge and strains, etc., and be able to package that and export that to the world, if you will. But at the same time, also open up domestic economies, because sub-Saharan Africa has got over 1 billion people, and when you look at the medical conditions that cannabis can address, we have millions of people that can benefit significantly from cannabis as a medicine. So I think South Africa is quite unique in that respect, because South Africa is looking to fully legalize cannabis, including adult use, and open it up to the population. A lot of other African countries are a lot more conservative, so they've legalized for export only in most cases. But I do think that South Africa will trigger a domino effect in terms of sort of acceptance of cannabis into the rest of the continent. And so from our perspective, it's an interesting one, because I think conventional knowledge will tell you that if you're late to the party, you've kind of missed the boat and so forth. But I think cannabis is quite complicated in the way that it is manifesting itself in a legal framework. And some of the early players will be some of the biggest losers, and some of the late players will be some of the most successful companies, just because of the ability to learn from the school fees that other companies have paid for the industry. So I am quite optimistic about the African cannabis industry. However, it will be the devil will be the detail in terms of legislation, regulation, sort of leveraging inherent competitive advantages that we have, and then integrating intelligently into a global supply chain.
Awesome. Yeah, I fully agreed. I mean, I think anyone who's practical about it would know that African botanicals is going to have a massive market for the next decade. So I think African operators should really be focusing on, when people think of Africa, they think of the nature available in the space. So I think botanicals coming from Africa will always have an appeal to the Northern Hemisphere in terms of supply and chain and quality. So it's an interesting one to play out. And I agree with you, regulation needs to accelerate. If I see another African country that's only approving cannabis for cultivation, for export only, I'll grind my teeth out, because it's really, we need to enable access to our local markets. It's ridiculous to believe that we are going to produce a world-class EU GMP competitive product from the bat in a local market that doesn't allow for any product development and improvements. It's almost ridiculous. So hopefully we'll see that. And on that point, let's go back to you, David. David, you guys have been successful with some exports. Talk us through, maybe, I know one of the markets you mentioned was Israel, and one of the requirements for anyone watching when dealing with the Israeli market is control union certification and getting through that whole procedure 109 in terms of approval. And I believe in May, there's more pesticides being added to the list in Israel for testing, which didn't help a lot of imports in the first 6 months of last year. around, restrictions coming through with the ministry. Talk us through some of your experiences with international shipments, and what were your lessons in that process that you could perhaps share in terms of insights and challenges?
Yeah, so obviously Rule 109 gave us a nice hard in, unfortunately. And it wasn't actually just 6 months, it was predominantly most of the year, because as much as it was the 6 months, there was the massive backlog from the whole year of people not being able to. Luckily for that, that's been relaxed, and that's going to now allow us to please God, hopefully ship some more bud out of Africa in the next few weeks. The challenges we faced the most would be finding the right supplies in terms of actual transportation, which we've luckily come to partnership with a great supplier, thankfully. You're mentioning Control Union there, obviously, very, very helpful in the whole process, obviously. The only advice that I could say is make sure that you control the shipping yourself. We've learned our lesson, unfortunately, and we take pride in making sure that we get our product the way it left our farm, to arrive at our customer's door in the same quality, the same, spec and whatnot. So I think the biggest challenge there would be finding the right supplier in terms of the export. I know there's a few companies coming online now in the South African market. Actually, I think from an overseas originated businesses that are going to help with the logistics of cannabis globally. But that to us was, the biggest challenge, I believe, that, and then together with the compliance of your documents, aligning your documents with your customers' documents is always going to be a challenge. And we've paid some school fees, but luckily, now we know how it works. It's a copy and paste, thankfully for us. There may be 1 or 2 extra steps involved, which we've now covered our tracks, and we've assured obviously our clients that that's all sorted. So we're good to go, but for sure, do your homework. Make sure you know what you're doing before you send a gram out of your facility, because you can get nicely punished.
No, 100%, and make sure you structure those payment terms as well. So that's always helpful. So I agree with that point. Phyllis Sunday, I want to maybe bring you in here in terms of, I know we have theoretically we should have the private club ruling by the Hayes Club on the 6th of June. It's been postponed multiple times in the country in terms of the access for private clubs. If there was a positive ruling in terms of, let's say private clubs were allowed and there was context and structure set forward, similar maybe to the clubs in the Spanish Catalonian region, do you see that as a potential opportunity for the farmers in the Eastern Cape to maybe say, okay, well, look, we're not going through these formal medical license structures. We're not going to do the whole GSP, GMP aspect of it. Maybe private clubs could be an economic driver for tourism, for access locally. Do you see that as a potential spin-off that might be more inclusive in the Eastern Cape? Is that possible within your network?
Yeah, thank you for that. Most certainly, there are great opportunities down this side. I mean, ranging from, as you mentioned, to tag along with tourism sector and other aspects. I mean, the Eastern Cape is vast, the Bonderland region is vast, and the more options there are for us to trade and to interact and to, be present in the industry, the better. And I think, especially referring to clubs, is a great opportunity for this, because there's so much more that can be enjoyed. And just because we have these land races that we're so touchy about, people have kind of like welcomed the various new strains, even more so. Actually, they have taken over the land race strains, which is a bit worrying. So I think if we were to look at private clubs and what they have to offer, also keeping in mind that we are dealing with land race, which is not particularly seen as the best for recreational use. So there's a wide range of strains floating about, and people are acquiring different sets of knowledge and skills for cultivation, for bettering their product. And people are keen on getting onto the industry. You know, we want to interact, we want to showcase what we have. So I think, yeah, there's a great big opportunities for such modalities in the area.
No, awesome, excellent. Well, let's hope that government does some reform. If not, the courts will probably reach a decision if they don't postpone anymore around private purposes, extension into clubs. And let's see, maybe we even end up in something drastic like Thailand, which will on the 9th of June also give out 1 million plants to registered users. I question the genetic quality of that stock input, considering obviously the commercial extracts in the region cannot exceed 0.2% THC, which again is that whole arbitrary hemp number. So I think let's get into this one, Gabriel. I mean, you went to the effort of setting up an indoor facility, going for GMP, trying to make sure that GMP is of the highest standard. You know, we're talking today ultimately about risk to cultivation aspects. What were some of the benefits that maybe drove you towards looking at indoor? In terms of also, you know, cultivation is not the only way to focus when it comes to exports. There's also derivatization of products, tertiary oils, extracts, formulations. Often formulations have a bit of proprietary protection that's maybe a little more easily built into something like a drug dossier. Talk to us about the decision around indoor as well as maybe extraction services.
Perfect. So yeah, let me start from the beginning. I think for the guys that got into this market early days, they had no other option but to go to the illicit market to go find a grower. And then based on the grower's advice, you would then enter into your cultivation operation. And I think that's for a lot of guys how they got into this market. So we followed the same route as most of those guys, and we were guided in terms of the indoor. And I'm on the one side, I'm quite happy that we went indoor, purely because you can control everything, especially focused like we are on the medicinal side of things. You want to be able to control your genetics, your climate. Well, first of all, based on your genetic, I believe genetics is the most important thing. So that's where you should start, finding a proper genetic line or plant or couple of plants that you are going to be formulating products from. Then making sure that you can get it stable. And one of the reasons, or one of the only ways to get it stable is to offer a stable climate. And indoor is perfect for that because you control literally everything from humidity, light, your CO2 levels, everything is controlled. We've added in a couple of extra things to ensure that we don't get mold and anything airborne. So we've added, even in our cultivation side, we've got primary, secondary, and HEPA filtered air, for example. We did not spare any costs in terms of that. And then I think one of the biggest challenges in this space is finding growers that has the skill or experience in growing at scale. And in the beginning, when I was doing research, I traveled the whole world and ended up in California and met with a lady called Mara Gordon, and she's quite well known in the medical cannabis side, and making medicines for kids and people with cancer and so forth. And the one joke was, I said to her, no, we've got a master grower, and she lost the plot, and she said to me, I can now guarantee you do not have a master grower. There's not a lot of people with 20. She said, we consider a master grower with 25 years experience, growing at scale, not in a garage. And I can tell you now, there might be a handful, if a handful, in South Africa. Also, just because of our market size wasn't that big in terms of the illicit market size. So yes, we had a lot of growers, but small scale growers. So she said to me, there's no chance you have a master grower. But so we found out. But I believe, and I think I speak for everybody that's in this space. And when in 2018, when I was in the States, I think they were struggling with the same thing, was labs. So one thing is growing consistently, having all your checks and balances on your side. When you send it out to a lab, you rely on the the report that comes back from them. And based on that, you make decisions on your side in terms of how to change things and all of that. The problem that we face, and I think any of these markets face the same thing, is having a reliable, consistent lab where you can send your results to, and you know your result that comes back is going to be consistent in terms of the standards that they use, and what you get back is, because I mean that ultimately is the ultimate test at the end of the day, is what did I produce and how do I test it. Now if you can't rely on your lab, what do you do? And I'll give a stupid example. I won't name the lab, but one of our first harvest we grew, and our growers like, this is going to be kick ass, and we send that into the lab to get a result back of 28% CBC, no THC. So we send a message back to them and said to them, guys, I don't think that your result was correct. Can you please recheck? They came back a few days later and said, yeah, sorry. It came in at 26% THC. We had a little mistake on our side. That's not really comforting because how do you now know? And the problem is I sat with other cultivators and they showed me two reports, one where they sent it to one lab, one where they sent it to the other lab, and they said to me, we actually took the same bud, we split it, and we sent it to two labs. One came in at 14% THC, other one at 28% THC. A 2% variant I can handle, a 14% variant. So I think that's the biggest challenge. So yes, one thing is control your environment, do all of those things right, but you need to have a credible place where you can make sure that your results are properly tested. And unfortunately, you're forced to go to third party. So you can do in-house testing, but ultimately when you want to export, and they're going to look at a third party, and finding that third party that's reliable, I think is one of the biggest challenges. So yeah, I think that has been the challenges in the space, but definitely from a medicinal side, I would say indoor. Having said that, the problem that we are all going to face is the more licenses that gets issued, it's going to be a race to the bottom in terms of price on flower. So the only way, if there's anybody listening wanting to get into the space, the only way, if you want to be a grower, a farmer in this space, you need to create a brand around your unique genetic line that you have. And it needs to be a brand that people want. So at the end of the day, when everybody is selling flower and it's getting extracted and all of that, you want to have that one brand where people are willing to pay a premium for your brand, your genetic line. In that case, I think, yes, there's merit in growing. But if you're just going to be growing at bulk in an indoor is not going to work. Your costs are too high, you can't compete. So if you're doing indoor and you want to be competitive recreationally and medicinal, you need to have that something that makes you unique, that you can be a brand on your own. You do not want to be in the space where you are going to sell your flower or your genetics to someone that's going to extract it into something else for their brand. Then I don't think there's longevity in that regard. It's too expensive for indoor. Yeah. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, Gabriel, I appreciate your point on testing there. I mean, I fully agree. Like, first things you should do, I mean, we as a market need to get proficiency testing established between labs, sending the same sample, having it regulated. You need to make sure those labs are ISO 17025 so that the methods and the precision and linearity is accredited. Those are the kind of things we need to see in the space. We see it in other pharmaceuticals. We see it in the food industry. So it's completely possible, if we're doing it for our wine industry, to send it to accredited labs for testing. So we should see the same here. And like you said, you don't want to be beholden to something, especially that's exported, and then that lab gets a completely different result and it puts you on the back burner. Your last thing and that's why you send samples to everyone who's watching, because it needs to pass the sample, because that can be destroyed. But if you're sending a bulk shipment and that gets destroyed at port, you also have to pay for the destruction, which is not something you ever want to hear in terms of that process. Cody, I'm going to bring you in before I go back to Luke here. In terms of the testing labs, and I think this is something you can speak to quite well. Do you even see that maybe in Utah, I'm not sure if you're allowed to send samples out of state for testing. Maybe the testing labs have hit proficiency in the region. I do think there would be enough experience for labs to really be quite proficient. I imagine California, depending on the regulatory environment, labs are also incentivized to give you the best possible result, which is something you've got to always monitor as a regulatory agency. So proficiency testing is so important. But what was your experience? Were the labs pretty much off standard? And also I've noticed that a lot of your products also come with associated COAs that obviously go through a list, aflatoxins, pesticides, it goes through heavy metals, some microbials as well. Maybe talk us through the lab side on your end and your experiences.
Yeah, as somebody that comes from the traditional market, I welcome the regulation and specifically lab testing with open arms in California for sure, because there's a lot of scary inputs that make it into cannabis there. The lab market in California did get kind of sold out in that like tests were being bought and sold, and it all became about potency. And one thing that Utah is doing right is that they have very few labs, but the thing that I think that they're doing wrong is that it's a state mandated lab, so there's zero competition. So we run in-house analytics, and I would absolutely recommend any large-scale cultivator going into any marketplace to do in-house analytics just as a side-by-side. Because if you have a lab technician and a lab set up professionally, you have a better idea of what you're getting. Gabriel spoke to that variance. There's always some kind of variance, but there can be radical variances. So we have this state mandated lab that we use here, and that's great. And we do trust them to a certain extent, but we always run side by sides with our in-house analytics. And I can't say enough about that.
No, awesome. Excellent. Good advice. I mean, if you're in the extraction world, how can you know what you're doing successfully if you're not testing and monitoring that? And I think also for in-process control, you've got to monitor your in-process control development. So you wait till the end of every harvest or the end of every batch to actually get your results. And that's not a great way to make iterative improvements in the facility. And we're in a globally competitive business. So analytics is a form of improvement if you apply it correctly. Luke, I want to jump to you because you've obviously, I imagine a lot of your initial activities were focused on medicinal traceability, the introduction of all the standards and how to develop SOPs around traceability. But since obviously your success with the Canton project around adult use in the Swiss market, have you seen some different requirements around traceability that I don't think there's maybe a need for it to be modified downward, but at the same time, I don't want to presume, at the end of the day, maybe they want a more simplistic, there is that botanical aspect, organic aspect to some of the cultivation. Maybe talk about it, some of the learning experiences with this trial project for adult use in Switzerland.
With great pleasure. Yeah. In the end of the day, I mean, it all depends again on what I mentioned in the beginning, right? What's your end product? What is be it your buyer? What is your consumer? What is your regulator expecting from you? What needs to be tested? What are your processes? What are the regulations for that? And therefore also what kind of standards you have to adhere to, right? And what was very refreshing to see with the Swiss recreational project was it has to be organic, soil bound, cultivated in Switzerland. Swiss organic, meaning you don't have any fertilizers specific yet for that crop, because there's no crop, there's nothing in the database yet, right? Also, they went full GACP, so they took that part from the medical, and they took some part from organic cultivation per se, but then down the line in the supply chain, they stuck to consumer goods and more in line with the tobacco consumer traceability of your end product. So they kind of they did a mix, right? I mean, GACP in the end, you say that's the beginning of GMP, but again, that's a philosophical question. It's not. I know, Jeff. It's not a philosophical question. Where does GACP end and where does GMP starts? It depends on your end product again. So what is really important, and what I always kind of keep preaching is like, everybody does this run for GMP, and how many people will sell a GMP product in the end of the day? How many people have a LOI that they somehow got from fell from a tree? Now they're running after that LOI that they know nothing will ever happen with. They're getting investors to put tons of money, sorry, I caught myself there, to put a lot of money into certain parts of your production, and then lose completely out on down the line in your supply chain, right? And that is always really, you know, look what you want to produce in the end, and then go from that point backwards. And for all you people that do CBD out there that are not making an API, stick to GAP, good agricultural practices. It's enough, depending again where you send it to, right? And as you mentioned before, Israel is now control union. So there is no, I mean, there's no black or white or one or the other in this whole game, and we see it at the Swiss recreational project, which was like, what do we do, right? I mean, we have those different standards out there. What do we go with? We got to keep the farm lobby happy. So we go organic. Organic means it has to be sold out. It cannot be indoor. It has to be in a greenhouse, maximum, if not outdoor, maximum 20% of THC, which means you should test it throughout your supply, throughout your production cycle. So it really, it's an exciting time. And I think it's a very exciting time for what we're doing in general, because you have to be flexible, right? It's not one or the other. It's not now this is what is now and then it goes there. It really depends. And for all cultivators or people going into the space or then also to manufacturing, really analyze where do you want to go with this? Because we've heard it multiple times here, right? I mean, just roughly 80+% of flower in Canada is laying around. It's not because they produce at too high costs. They just basically produce a flower that cannot be sent to Europe. And what other market is there? So there is no there, and that's the beauty of it, right? And that's the beauty of, there will always be chances for new businesses and new people coming into the industry by being wary of where they're going with it. And I know I've derailed there a little bit, but really figure out who's your customer, get close with them, make great agreements, get testing in between, get your COAs done on a proper manner that are linked to where you want to go, etc., etc., etc. So there is that. That's the beauty of compliance, right? Now that's the international market. But I think what you guys talked about earlier, the South African or generally subcontinental African market is also very, very exciting. And I'm excited to see that balance between the traditional medicine market and the other side of the consumer goods. So it's yeah, I know I completely derailed there, but it's exciting.
No, awesome.
No, it's exciting.
Good points there. It makes me think of an article. We talked about this, Sibs, as well, about, a lot of people promote, the German imports. But if you look at what's been dispensed, it looks like half of the product that's moved into Germany is actually officially being dispensed, which creates a completely different picture in terms of, wow, is the market absorption actually there? Where is it actually being held? And also makes me think of stability, data around cannabis products. That's going to be, I think at the end of the day, we're going to be looking more and more at label claims, stability, product recall. I think those are the conditions that are going to define this next generation of cannabis products, is how close to label are we, and is it stable enough for product consumption to withhold? And I want to ask Sibs, and maybe I'm going to open the same question up to everyone, because I think we're approaching towards the end of the webinar here, and we want to grab a few questions from the comments as well. But I'd like to go around and get everyone's input here around, if you're looking out, let's not make it a 10-year forecast, because that's an impossible peg. Let's talk 2 years. We've seen radical changes in the last 2 years in terms of global acceptance, improvement in drug policy. We've seen cannabis move in different directions, from novel foods in the UK region. We're going to see a diversification of products, a pharmaceutical formulation, novel foods, general wellness, and responsible adult use increasingly. That obviously the responsible adult use market impacts the uptake and absorption of the medicinal markets, but there's benefits and drawbacks to each. Maybe can you guys give a bit of a spread, how you see in your jurisdictions, in your regions, or globally, in your view, how do you see the cannabis market developing over the next, let's just call it 24-month horizon? We don't want to speculate on US federal regulation. I mean, Cody's welcome to. You know, if the DA were to reclassify to a Schedule 2 or 3, I mean, it would create complete chaos in the market. Dispensaries, I do not think, are set up to be in an FDA model with, you know, let's just call it more compliance sourcing in terms of really having the full traceability. Talk us through your visions. Sibs, let's start with you. So I'm putting you on the spot, and I'm giving everyone else a minute to think about it. Yeah, in a 2-3 minute overview, how do we see cannabis developing in the next 2 years?
Sure. So I think in terms of Africa, South Africa is going to sort of have a disproportionate amount of activity, simply because the South African government is very, very intentional in terms of wanting to use cannabis as a catalyst for economic growth, rural development, sustainable industrialization, and so forth. And, you know, I think South Africa is very much going to be sort of the example that a lot of other African countries look at to decide whether cannabis works or not in terms of a domestic industry and a domestic framework. You know, we do have to remember that cannabis is, you know, sort of 3 verticals or industries. There's medical, there's industrial in terms of materials, and there's adult use in terms of recreational, etc. So South Africa kind of opening up all 3 and sort of working its way through a domestic economy and so forth will be in many ways what will be the catalyst or the deterrent for other African countries, which is why I think it's quite an important step in that process. I do also think that the South African cannabis industry will benefit immensely from the expertise that we have around agriculture, around healthcare and pharmaceuticals. And there is, in the perfect world, I think somewhat of a convergence in terms of talent and people with skills shifting into cannabis from these legacy industries to help propel the industry and provide an extra level of sort of ability to execute and credibility. And I think in an even better world, that is also driven and incorporating rural and traditional farmers who are actually at the heart of this developmental plan and process. But I think the one thing I always caution is that there's probably as much of a likelihood that this industry struggles and actually ultimately, you know, doesn't succeed in the way that we sort of know that it can, in the event that government doesn't really sort of set up the right frameworks for the industry to succeed. So that component of risk, you know, makes things quite challenging. But despite that, well, there will, I believe, still be a lot of local champions who integrate into an international supply chain, just a lot less than what we can have if we don't have, you know, sort of the right legislative framework and sort of bringing together different stakeholders, but driven by government ultimately.
Okay, awesome, 100%. David, your forecast on the next 24 months?
So in truth, I think I might get put on the burner here, but I honestly don't see much change purely because people are trying to get too fancy in my mind. I think people are trying to, you know, they're all over the show. Whereas if you look at our personal project itself, we didn't get fancy. We put up a greenhouse, we became compliant, we grew flower, we were told how to ship flower, we listened and we exported. Instead of sitting there trying to get fancy, finding CEOs and growers and licenses and lands and 500 staff members and raising $300 million cash and getting clever and fancy. And I think that's where people are wasting a hell of a lot of time, especially in South Africa. And I got pretty much no experience in South Africa whatsoever. But from all the coffees and meetings that we've had, I feel like everyone's trying to get all of their ducks in a row before they even take 2 steps. And we've taken the approach of, instead of, you know, what do they say? They say, don't run, first walk. And we've done the total opposite. We hit the ground running. We got our project off the ground, and, you know, That just goes to show we've got proof in the pudding. So my vision is, truthfully, I don't see much change unless people catch a wake up, do the bare minimum, get a facility that's off the ground and start shipping out cannabis. I mean, hopefully I'm wrong, and maybe I'll get put on the Bernie, and maybe the people in the questions will probably shout at me, but that's my genuine opinion. I really believe that people need to just keep things simple, considering how complex this industry is. And don't get me wrong, we've paid a lot of school fees on trying to get fancy in very certain areas. But what we've learned is that what we've done works because we've kept it simple. We haven't gotten fancy. We found the right clients. We've got the right suppliers, and we've shipped cannabis. That's the truth.
Awesome, excellent. I think what's happened at Aurora Sky with last week's announcement, seeing cannabis, vegetative plants on lifts back and forth, moving around the facility, is maybe a testament to, don't overcomplicate, don't over automate what was always a very personal relationship with a plant.
Well, even more so
at the end of the day,
a continent like us, keep it simple. There are millions of people who need jobs.
Yeah.
Just employ the local guys, and a lot of them know how to grow cannabis, funny enough. So keep it simple.
No, absolutely. I like that advice. Gabriel, let's pick it up for you.
Okay, so maybe a bit of a mixed message. So I believe cannabis is going to open the door for all plant-based medicines globally. And I think that is also why it's taking a little bit longer than we all expect, because I think everybody knows that once cannabis is through the door, psychedelics and all of these things are right behind them. And we all know the medical benefits of cannabis. We focus on medicine side. We all know the research that's coming through on the psychedelic side, and what threat it poses to the big pharma guys out there. So I believe on that side, it is going to take long. And David, I tend to agree with you on the one side that everybody is overcomplicating this thing, and you have to ask yourself why. And I'm talking from the regulatory point of view. When they schedule cannabis as a Schedule 6, for example, when they issued our GMP license, they wanted to say it's a cannabis GMP license. And we fought them and we said, what is a cannabis GMP license? A GMP license is the facility, and cannabis is purely a product line. So what on earth is a cannabis GMP license? So the point I'm trying to make is I think the regulators are trying to put cannabis, they've got this whole Medicines Act where they classify everything, and cannabis is there. But yet when they try and regulate it, they put it outside of all of this and they say, we're going to regulate it on its own. And it doesn't make sense. So I think, to David's point, everything needs to be simplified. And hopefully the regulators will get onto that bandwagon. I believe, my view is, it feels like our regulator, and I think all the countries that's coming online, they don't go look at what's happened globally. They don't go and look at what happened in Canada. How did they roll out? How did they overtax? And then it became a problem so that the black market still carried on. So we're all going down that same pathway, and it's 10 years away. So in the beginning, I thought, okay, at least we can learn from Canada and we can springboard ourselves 10 years. It doesn't look like we're doing it that way. So it's going to be a long process. Having said that, in the last 6 months, things feel like it's been getting a little bit more traction globally. We've had much more interest. It feels like in some cases it's getting a little bit easier to engage with people. The one caution also, to Luke's point earlier, don't lend your ears to everybody, because every second call we get is, are you guys going to go EU GMP? No, there's no need to go EU GMP. Our facility is only this big. The market that we can service is bigger than our facility. So we don't have to be EU GMP. So be careful, decide, pick your lane and stick to your lane. I think that's the message. This is, when I started, I had this analogy whereby it's like watching an Indiana Jones movie. You're running into this cave and there's all this gold and treasure everywhere, and this thing is collapsing, this cave. So you need to decide, what are you going to run out with? If you're going to stay in the cave and just look at all these shiny things, it's going to collapse on you. So pick your lane. If you get out of the cave and you're alive and you have whatever little thing you got out with, at least you got out with it and you got something out of this industry. And I think that is where we're at. So pick your lane, decide what you want to develop, start there. Ultimately, I think it's a race to the bottom in terms of flower prices. It is going to become another commodity like anything else in the farming space. And unfortunately, the farmer is always going to get the end of the stick, the short end. And the retailers and the guys who builds the brands, that's the guys who's going to make the money at the end of the day. So my advice is build a brand. If you want to be on the cultivation side only, build your brand around that. Focus on good genetics, create something that is unique to you that people want, and build a brand around that then, if you want to stay on the flower side. But don't just go and put up massive facilities thinking that the markets are there. I think we all made that mistake. You look at the figures and you say, holy crap, you can get €5 a gram or whatever. And by the time you get there, it's like, wow, that was just an academical figure. You can't get your thing out. So be very careful. Start small. Start small and build a decent foundation before you grow. That's my advice if cannabis is the thing that you're going to stay in.
Awesome. Yeah, I like that analogy of the Aladdin's cave. You know, like you got to move quickly and you got to know what to grab and when to grab it. And try to, you know, map that out before you get into the cave, so you know where you're going before the roof starts collapsing. Because in many regards, I think a lot of cultivators can relate to you in that point, because it's there was a lot of rushing, and there's still so many people rushing into the space, and it's like, get educated first. And I mean, this is what these webinars are for. Phyllis Sunday, your forecast, and then I'm going to jump to Luke and then Cody, because Cody, I saw there was 1 or 2 questions as well about our sponsor Aeroside, about your experience with the brand. So Phyllis Sunday, talk us through your experience or forecast for the next 24 months.
I'm with David on this one, in not seeing much of a change anytime soon. And the reason for this, I mean, we've just had the bill come back. It's been amended, and it gives you a clear picture of where legislation is going. It's stalling. It's going to take forever before there's any proper guidance. So for me, looking into various other options, what people could do in the meantime while we wait for all of this to happen, because we are edgy. We want to start doing stuff, and we bound. If we say, okay, well, we want to use our biomass to process it for whatever, then everyone's going to ask, okay, so where's the flower? What you're doing with the flower? So it's a bit of a catch-22. We feel really stuck. But in terms of the clubs, the private clubs and other modalities, I would actually like to hear from everybody else where they think there are possibilities for our situation, you know. But I think we are lucky in that regard, that we've got some of our government, like your departments of agriculture and others, really keenly trying to penetrate the policy space, trying to assist us in trying to resolve this big void. So I think, yeah, looking into different options, really into what we could be doing in the meantime is pretty much all that we can do. But otherwise, I don't really see legislation taking us through it easily anytime soon. I'm seeing a good 5 years while they do the back and forth with trying to create the policy. So yeah, we need to move.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think the private club ruling is going to be important for some form of domestic access and commercialization. So let's hope it's not postponed for the 4th or 5th time. in the courts. Let's hope that it finally sees its day in court to reach an outcome and hopefully set some standards for increased access. Let's jump to our international guests. Luke, your forecast, and then we're going to go to Cody. And then Cody, I'm going to ask you, there's been 1 or 2 aero side questions, so I'm going to ask you about that as well to close out. Kick us off, Luke.
Well, I'm going to stick to Switzerland for this one. And we actually have now planted, or one of our customers and partners has planted the first seed of legal recreational cannabis in about 3 to 4 months. That will go over the counter. So we will have the first actual legal recreational cannabis that is part of a pilot project, a study. It is a study. It is not legalized yet. So don't get this the wrong way. It is still the first a product that is going to go over the counter, in this case through a pharmacy, but not on a medical basis, but on a consumer basis for a consumer in that case. So that is super exciting. So I know we heard some mixed things about Africa at the moment, so I'll just stick to the things that are positive and give this a bit of a positive spin, what is happening in Switzerland at the moment. We do also have a change in law in about a month from now in the medical cannabis field, where we do not need 3 entities anymore to sign off, but the whole dispensing will get a lot easier. Licenses for export and for import are going to actually be available. There's a whole shift on that side. So meaning Switzerland being able to import and export in the future gives also some hope for products. This is medical. This now would be EU GMP. That gives them a hope to the EU GMP facilities down in South Africa. So yeah, it is opening up. It is not opening up everywhere at the same pace. We're looking in a couple of more months to a year to Germany, and once Germany falls, everybody else falls along. So yeah, I do see not just a tunnel. There is somewhere there is some light, but again, it depends. It depends what you can get out of that tunnel before it closes. To go back to Aladdin's cave.
No, 100%. Good point. I mean, the German adult use market and what happens and how long it takes. If it goes live 2024, I think it will be a domino for European markets. And then there's always the Asian market. It's going to be the last one probably to topple, but it is by historic use quite a big market between those 2+ billion people. So we'll all probably be hopefully set up and have executed. And I think they might have just learned all the lessons from us in that journey. So it might be less of an Aladdin's cave for China when they decide to commercialize. But Cody, you've probably seen it the most amongst all the different markets in the States. What is your view on, you've seen the most mature market. Talk us through it.
Right. So we saw a huge expansion in California with these large brands coming in. And what we're seeing now, which for me is really exciting, is kind of a contraction in that large brand market and a move from the consumer towards a more craft brand or a boutique brand. And that's kind of the spot that I've always tried to position myself in, where it's quality and consistency before quantity. It's not unlike what we've seen in the beer and wine market, craft beer, high-end wine, things like that. So I hope that trend continues, and that's where we're positioning ourselves from kind of a flower and edible standpoint. On a medicinal side, we're seeing a lot more pharmaceutical-based products hitting the market. We have a pharmaceutical wing of our kind of parent company, and we're developing tablets and things like that are more typical for that type of market.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That dosage form variety is going to come in the medical space, and the formulation is going to be your only form of protection. So I do see that there's going to be those SKUs, and those SKUs are always interesting. And I know that we've seen some questions in there. There's been some on social equity as well, which we'll try to address. But I want to just get in this discussion around, you talked about quality, focusing on quality first and foremost. You've also been a user of our sponsor today, Aeroside. How has that technology impacted your cultivation practices? I mean, talk us through some of the benefits maybe of the technology.
Well, honestly, it was a real game changer for me, coming out of the traditional market and then scaling up, which again, what Gabriel said, that is absolutely the hardest thing to do. And the people that did that realized they needed to go commercial with their approach, with their equipment and their design and their installation. And one of the biggest problems for an indoor cultivator is that the atmospheric conditions and parameters that cannabis really thrives in, which is fairly high humidity and fairly high heat, is also a petri dish, the perfect petri dish for mold, mildew, microcontaminants, things like that. And so it became very obvious that if we wanted to protect our large scale, high value crops, we had to find some, commercial application things just like the Aeroside provides. And there's a lot of products like that on the market. But Aeroside is the one that I found to be the best kind of plug and play at a very reasonable price. And it's to the point now where I simply will not design or build or operate a facility without something like this, because it's so instrumental into protecting the quality, not only for our bottom line, but for our consumer, our medical patients. We test our cannabis, our flower, in parts per billion for microcontaminants. And so I have to make sure that nothing like that sneaks into our crop.
Okay, awesome, great. Yeah, I mean, that's a very fair point. I mean, at the end of the day, air is probably, besides water, besides your, what you put into that facility in terms of substrate, depending if it's hydroponic or not, is the most prolific use of space. So controlling the space that your air occupies is a good rationale for any pharmaceutical facility, and definitely for quality of any botanical. So guys, there's quite a lot of questions. I know we're running out of time there. Sebs, I don't know if you've got one or two you want to pull from the chat. The only one I can see here right now is as well, there's been a lot of comments about inclusion and social equity. I mean, we saw New York potentially propose, distribution being more inclusive as well in terms of prior sentencing around cannabis crimes. I think the biggest thing is how to hack the inclusion principle in South Africa. We've seen too much individual capital driving around the licensed cultivation. The one thing that I can hope to see maybe with government is that when it's a pharmacy model or it becomes an adult use dispensary model, that perhaps we have more inclusion at the retail level, if it's allowed, and that those cultivators that then tie into that value chain, maybe they're licensed, maybe they're co-ops, they go through an aggregated testing facility or extractor. But I know, Sips, if you've got a comment on inclusion here that you'd like to maybe address, and then we can maybe have you close us out for the webinar. And some few last words. And thank you to all the panelists. It's been an exceptional wealth of information. It's really one way I think we could go on for hours discussing this. And I think there are definitely people who'd want to hear these comments and points, because you all speak from massive experience. And I think that's the thing you can't hack in this industry, is people with real experience and the real war stories to trade about how this industry works and operates. To you, Sibs. I just need to unmute there. Cool.
Sure. So, look, I think the question on inclusion is a really, really important one. I think if you take a step back from cannabis altogether and just kind of look at what are some of the major challenges that society is going through as a whole, as a global economy or global village, inequality is probably very high up on that list, if not number one. And you can sort of even see it with sort of the inflation crisis that we're going through at the moment. It's kind of just starting, but inflation is quite literally sort of drowning individuals in terms of economic ability and so forth. So and inequality is the root cause of a lot of social and political tension around the world. And so cannabis is an old industry, but in many ways a new industry in terms of a legal framework. And so it's almost the option of developing this industry without that social equity component, or without that sort of developmental focus or lens is basically just contributing more towards a much bigger ticking time bomb around inequality, particularly South Africa, arguably the most unequal society in the world, and Africa, also very, sort of high on the Gini coefficient. So there is no choice. I think one of the sort of reasons why I'm a little bit more optimistic in terms of timelines, let's say from a South African perspective, is the fact that South Africa is just a few sort of situations away from a much more significant situation than the July unrest that we saw last year. We very much, there are too many South Africans cannot economically cannot function. People cannot provide for their families. People, and it is very much a a situation that will force, I think, the government's hand in many ways in terms of looking to address some of these concerns and challenges. But let's see how that plays out. But I am a little bit more optimistic because of how desperate the situation is from our perspective, as an example. There's many questions and comments that unfortunately we will not get a chance to get to. But we, really, firstly, I'd like to thank all the panelists and Jeff, you as the moderator, for a really robust discussion with so many different perspectives on the industry in terms of where we are, where we're going, and how to participate in this industry as an entrepreneur or someone who's looking to make a mark within the space. I'd like to also thank our sponsors, Aeroside, our sort of premium sponsor, for making today's session possible, but as well as Schindler's, Separations, 7NRG, Zubalola, and of course our US partner, Global Go, for making this happen. And lastly, I'd like to encourage everyone to also have a look at Friends of Hemp, and as and where you can support the organization, I think it would be greatly appreciated. We are also engaging a number of other charities within the space that are working with traditional and rural growers and communities. We're having good discussions with Pila on that front. So we are looking to use this platform to ensure that we are, sort of moving together as a collective in supporting the legalization of the cannabis industry. So thanks once again to everyone for making this a really, really insightful and robust discussion. And we very much look forward to engaging and collaborating with people that are participants, the panelists, and it's a bumpy road ahead, but I think one that continues to be very exciting within this industry. So
awesome.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Sips. Thanks, everyone. We're looking forward to the next webinar. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good evening.
Cheers.
Bye.